Even while the newly announced Europe-US trade deal seems to be kind of falling apart before our very eyes, Mark Carney and Canadians generally are noting the looming August 1st deadline, and the race is on to get the basic outline of an agreement of some sort there. What must Carney and his team be noting when he looks at the circus for the European deal as it's unfolded over the last few days? Well, a couple of things particularly stand out. One, these deals are obviously not deals. They are the very vaguest of aspirational statements. Two, for something so important, the fact is that the outcomes have been astonishingly amateurish, with Trump's version of what has been agreed and the other country's version of what has been agreed often hilariously at odds. I mean, hilarious for non-involved observers, not so funny for the countries concerned. Three, Trump is not interested, clearly, in a fair deal. Every deal released so far has been obviously and celebrated on the American side as being egregiously one-sided. This doesn't make happy viewing if you're trying to nail something down on behalf of Canada or anywhere else, come to that. So what did I mean about the EU deal falling apart? Well, simply that many of the details that were announced have now been revealed in the statements from both sides to have sharply different interpretations. Do you know what we call it when two sides thoroughly disagree on what they want? Well, suffice it to say, it's not conventionally called a deal. The very next day, after announcing the biggest deal ever, the European Commission and White House published their own versions of what was agreed. They seriously didn't match. The White House said that the 15% tariff rate would apply to EU-manufactured pharmaceuticals starting in 2 days' time, August 1st. The EU said that actually such tariffs would only come in after the US concludes its investigation into pharmaceuticals, some way down the line. The EU said the $600 billion investment in the US was an intention, not a guarantee, since it's down to private companies whether or not to invest. But the US version insists nevertheless, no, it's clear that the EU will invest the money. According to Trump and the White House, the EU has agreed to purchase significant amounts of US military equipment. Well, according to the EU, there was no such pledge. I quote, "That was an expression of expectation on the part of President Trump that the increased defense expenditure would benefit US defense companies because of the quality of the US defense equipment." And it goes on. The White House, the EU and US will work together to address non-tariff barriers in agriculture, including streamlining requirements for certificates for US pork and dairy products. Well, the EU's version, we made no concession on food safety rules and our right to regulate. White House, tariffs on steel, aluminium and copper remain at 50%. EU, there will be a zero tariff quota, with 50% to be applied to amounts over that quota. The White House, stated intention to address digital trade barriers. The EU, nope, absolutely no commitment on digital regulation or digital taxes. So if you can have had trade teams locked in difficult talks for weeks, as they allegedly have been, and you end up with this Chinese whispers mishmash of misunderstandings, then what on earth are people dignifying with the label deal here? And it isn't just the EU deal, it's an emerging consistent theme. Japan, for example. The US claimed that Japan had pledged to invest $550 billion in the United States, an investment vehicle by Japan that would be deployed, according to President Trump's wishes, in whatever sectors he thought to be important. Hotels, maybe? Just as a for instance? No, said Japan. Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba said it would include loans and investments, more of a company-led endeavour, not outsourced to Donald Trump's fancies. Vietnam, on the other hand, Vietnam went through the process of negotiating with the US trade team and agreeing an effective tariff rate of 15%, only then to see President Trump announce the deal saying that it had agreed to 20%, and they're now having to fight rearguard action to win back what had already been agreed, no doubt at a cost of further concessions. Then there's Indonesia. Trump said Indonesia had agreed to remove restrictions on exports to the US of industrial commodities, which implied it would end its ban on the export of nickel ore used to make stainless steel. Well, no, said Indonesia, we agreed to export processed minerals, not raw nickel ore. A revelation that deeply disappointed the US steel industry. When challenged about any and all of these details, what did the White House have to say? Nothing that your average mobster might not have had to say in a Quentin Tarantino movie. These countries made these agreements. We expect them to abide by their commitments, and if they renege, the president reserves the ability to raise their tariffs again. So what now for Canada, staring the deadline in the face with all of that in the background? Obviously, what they see in the EU deal is a wholly unequal deal, one that's getting a huge kickback from some of the European states, but also deliberate vagueness, and then the Trump administration seeking to leverage that vagueness to insist on an interpretation that most benefits the US. And that's a typical scammer's trick. To get someone invested in having reached an agreement, then exploit ambiguities to extend the agreement, at which point it's much harder for them to push back, because they risk losing what they thought they'd already gained and what they've already sold inwardly to their own people. It's hard to believe such crude tricks, the sort of thing people going door to door might try out on the elderly and unwary, that could actually work at the level of nation-states negotiating trade. But that is what they are consistently trying to pull. And you can add to that the fact that Trump doesn't just want to do trade deals, he is demanding payoffs. Hundreds of billions to be invested and or spent with the United States. Now, arguably, the EU got pushed into the deal they did because of two factors. One, they had no real leverage over the United States, so the power imbalance was there to be ruthlessly exploited, as it was. And two, their countries would have suffered from no deal, and a number of the member states might find their democracies in big trouble. For Mark Carney, he has stated in advance that Canada would not just take a deal at any price, would not sign up to a bad deal. The biggest power in a negotiation is the ability to walk away from the table. That immediately implies he's seeking something that so far nobody has achieved. And he does so with the Trump administration now full of confidence, having successfully bullied a number of previous countries, including the great big EU, into submission. To do that, Canada would have to have leverage against the United States that Europe didn't. Now, maybe there are some elements of that. The US wants to buy Canada's energy, and there are some real pains for their side if the outcome from a spiralling trade war with its neighbour hits it. Also, Canada has the Arctic and America's need of it for defence. President Trump has announced he wants to build a big, beautiful missile shield over America, but he can't build that without Canada as an active partner. It is significantly less leverage than China has, with its stranglehold on rare earth minerals, but it's something. Secondly, you then have the question whether Canadian citizens would rally around if Trump refuses to give them a fair deal, and would they endure the punishment that a trade war would subject them to for the amount of time it might take to then get the other side to back down? Right now, both sides are talking down the prospects of a deal, probably calculated to put pressure on the other side. So Mark Carney said, there is a landing zone that's possible, but we have to get there and we'll see what happens. He said it might not be possible to strike a deal with the United States that includes the removal of tariffs. On the other side, President Trump has said that he does not expect to reach a trade deal with Canada. He said this, "We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. I think Canada could be one where there's just a tariff, not really a negotiation. Well, of course, only 2 weeks ago he was saying he was very positive about a deal with Canada. So, a new day comes along, slightly different words come out of Trump's mouth. You just ignore them and focus on what's actually being done. Well, according to Canadian officials talking to the Politico website, what's actually being done is meetings between the two sides that in no sense could be termed a negotiation. They are, they said, chaotic and one-sided, with the Americans recycling grievances and offering no path forward. Reportedly, the Trump team is inconsistent, swerves to a new topic every time the two sides meet, down to and including whining about the fact that Canadians are boycotting American products. Well, yes, cause, meet effect. It will, of course, be a lot of pain should there be no deal and Trump decides that he can't afford to do what everyone accuses him of doing. The taco label. Trump always chickens out. At the moment, he is threatening a 35% tariff on Canadian goods, along with a 50% tariff on steel and aluminium, and a 25% tariff on cars and trucks. At the point of all this kicking off, Canada sold 3/4 of its products to the United States. Switching that is not a short-term project, as you can imagine. Now, it's worth noting that, for now, a lot of Canadian goods are covered by the former trade agreement reached during Trump's first term, the USMCA. But then, that agreement is up for review next year. Can't say there's much doubt how it's going to go down. So you might as well take this as a rehearsal. Mark Carney has tried to rally the provinces of Canada with a vision of the country becoming an energy superpower, with large infrastructure projects being kicked off quickly to support its economy in a transition period. That hasn't entirely achieved unity, unsurprisingly. Doug Ford's Ontario is in bullish mood, pushing for retaliation if Trump brings major tariffs to bear. But some of us have been less enthusiastic, looking, for instance, at the impact of tariffs already imposed on US steel, which are hurting them quite badly. That is the heart of the dilemma. The EU did not have the internal cohesion to fight a trade war, so it settled for the least worst option it could get, in a situation where the other side knew it was weak and it could push its advantage. The Trump team might feel Canada is less weak, but they surely also suspect there is less cohesion in Canadian society than there was, for instance, around the election time, when Canadians were perhaps more united than they'd been for decades. If it comes down to it, that might well end up being the proposition that gets tested. As an outsider as I am, I wish someone other than China would stand up to the bully. But I recognise that's very easy for an outsider to say. The call gets made, as it must be, by the people who then pay the price. Now, we don't know what will happen. The deadline may well get pushed back, a new threat issued, the circus will continue, seems relatively likely. Or we might find out that yes, it really is time to stare Trump in the face and find out how determined he really is to shake off the hated label of taco.